The van started groaning 15 minutes into what should have been the easiest run of my week. My name's Marcus Chen, and I've been driving transport for Riverside Memorial Services for 8 years now. Before that, I hauled freight cross-country for nearly a decade, so I know what weight sounds like when it settles into a vehicle's frame. I know the difference between a full load and an empty one, between cargo that shifts and cargo that stays put. What I heard that Tuesday morning in October of 2023 was something I'd never experienced before: the deep, metal-fatiguing groan of a suspension system under more load than it was designed to carry. The pickup had been routine. St. Mary's Hospital, 3rd floor morgue, one body for transfer to our facility. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, 73 years old, passed peacefully in her sleep after a long battle with emphysema. Her daughter had chosen our services, wanted a simple viewing before cremation. Nothing complicated, nothing rushed. I'd loaded the gurney into the transport bay myself, secured the straps according to protocol, checked the refrigeration unit, and started the 20-minute drive across town. The van was a 2020 Ford Transit, specially modified for funeral transport, with a reinforced floor, tie-down points, and climate control in the rear compartment. It had hauled everything from single transfers to triple loads during mass casualty events. I knew its limits, its sounds, its quirks. The suspension was rated for 2,500 pounds over the base vehicle weight, and Mrs. Vasquez couldn't have weighed more than 130 pounds, even with the gurney and equipment. But as I merged onto Highway 9, heading toward the Riverside exit, the rear of the van began to sag. Not dramatically, just enough that I felt the steering change, the way the vehicle wanted to pull slightly to the right, the kind of settling you'd expect if someone had loaded another body without telling you. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and walked around to the rear doors. The security locks were engaged, the seals intact. Through the small viewing window, I could see Mrs. Vasquez exactly as I'd left her, centered on the gurney, properly positioned, the white sheet drawn up to her chin. Nothing had shifted. Nothing looked disturbed. Back in the driver's seat, I checked the manifest tablet mounted to the dashboard. 1 pickup, 1 delivery, total declared weight including gurney and equipment, 215 pounds. The numbers matched what I'd logged at the hospital, but when I started driving again, the groaning resumed immediately, low, rhythmic creaking that seemed to pulse with every slight bump in the road. I called dispatch on the radio. Unit 7 to base. I'm having some suspension noise on the Vasquez transfer. Everything's secure back there, but the van's riding heavy. Copy, Unit 7. Any visible damage to the vehicle? Negative. Just sounds like I'm carrying more weight than I should be. Run a secondary check on your load securement and continue to destination unless you feel the vehicle is unsafe. I did another walk around, another visual check through the rear window. Mrs. Vasquez lay still and properly positioned. The gurney straps were tight, the floor clear of any additional items. But something about the view through that small window bothered me, a detail I couldn't quite identify that made me study the scene longer than necessary. The refrigeration unit's display panel showed normal operating temperature, 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity sensor read standard levels. But there was an additional readout I'd never paid attention to before, something the manufacturer had included for diagnostic purposes. It was labeled thermal mass detection and showed a digital representation of heat signatures within the compartment. On a normal transport, it displayed a single gradually cooling outline where the deceased lay on the gurney. Today, it showed 2 distinct signatures. One was the expected shape on the gurney, the familiar outline of a human form cooling toward ambient temperature. The second signature sat upright next to the gurney, roughly the size and temperature of a living person. It faced toward the front of the van, as if looking over the driver's shoulder. I stared at that display for nearly a full minute, telling myself it had to be a malfunction. Equipment fails all the time in our line of work. Sensors get confused, displays glitch, readings become unreliable, but the image remained steady and consistent, 2 thermal signatures where there should have been 1. The drive to Riverside Memorial took 18 more minutes, and every one of them stretched like an hour. The suspension continued its rhythmic groaning, The rear of the van sat lower than it should have, and that second thermal signature never wavered from its position beside the gurney. I found myself checking the rear-view mirror obsessively, even though the transport bay was separated from the driver's cabin by a solid partition. There was nothing to see, but I kept looking anyway. When I backed up to the receiving dock at Riverside, Joe Kellerman came out to help with the unload. Joe's been with the funeral home longer than anyone, and he's handled thousands of transfers. He walked around to the rear doors, then stopped and looked at me with a puzzled expression. "Marcus, what else you got in there? Van's sitting awful low." "Just Mrs. Vasquez. Single transfer from St. Mary's." Joe frowned and checked his paperwork. "Manifest shows one body, but this van's loaded like you're carrying 3. He unlocked the rear doors and swung them open. "Let's have a look." The sight that greeted us was exactly what we expected: Mrs. Vasquez on the gurney, properly positioned and secured. The transport bay clean and organized. But the moment those doors opened, the van suspension released with an audible sigh, the rear end rising several inches, as if a tremendous weight had just stepped out. Joe walked around the vehicle again, checking the tires, the frame, anything that might explain what we'd both felt. "Suspension looks fine now," he said. "Maybe you had some kind of hydraulic buildup that released when we opened the doors." I helped him wheel Mrs. Vasquez into the preparation room, completed the transfer paperwork, and prepared to drive back to base. But before leaving, I checked the thermal display one more time. It showed exactly what it should have shown all along: the normal background temperature of an empty transport bay. No signatures, no anomalies. Just an empty compartment cooling back to ambient air temperature. The drive back to the depot was normal. No suspension problems, no unusual weight, no thermal signatures on the diagnostic display. The van handled exactly as it should, with an empty load bay. I filed my transport report, noting the suspension noise as a potential maintenance issue, but I didn't mention the thermal readings. Some things are difficult to explain in official paperwork. That was 6 months ago. Since then, I've driven that same van on dozens of transfers without any problems. The suspension works perfectly. The thermal detection system reads normally, and the vehicle handles every load exactly as expected. But I still check that diagnostic display on every transport, and sometimes not often, but occasionally I see things that don't match what's actually in the back. Last week, during a transfer from Mercy General, the thermal display showed not just the expected cooling signature of the deceased, but also a smaller outline sitting beside the gurney, child-sized, facing forward, as if someone young had climbed in for the ride. The manifest listed only one body, an elderly man who died alone in the hospital. No family present, no visitors in his final days. But according to the sensors, he wasn't making the journey to his final rest by himself. I've learned not to discuss these readings with dispatch or my coworkers. Equipment malfunctions aren't unusual in our line of work, and unexplained sensor data falls into the category of minor technical issues rather than serious problems. The important thing is that we complete our transfers safely and with dignity, delivering families' loved ones to their final arrangements without incident. But sometimes, during long drives on empty highways, I find myself wondering who these additional passengers might be, whether they're saying goodbye, or just making sure their loved ones don't have to travel alone, whether the thermal sensors are malfunctioning, or whether they're simply detecting something that's always been there, something we were never meant to see. The van still groans occasionally under weight that shouldn't exist, and I've stopped trying to explain it. I stopped driving Highway 9 to work after the 7th driver called in with the same story. "My name is Elena Rodriguez, and I coordinate night transport services for 3 funeral homes in the county. It's a job that requires precision. Families are waiting, viewing schedules are tight, and crematorium appointments can't be moved. When I tell a driver to pick up at Mercy General at 11:15 and deliver to Riverside Memorial by midnight, that timing matters. Grief doesn't wait, and neither do the logistics of death. I've been working this position for 12 years, ever since I finished my degree in mortuary science. Before the coordination job, I drove transport myself for 3 years, so I understand the rhythms of the work. I know how long it takes to navigate hospital loading docks, how traffic patterns affect delivery times, and what routes work best during different shifts. Highway 9 between Mercy General and the 3 funeral homes I coordinate for is normally a 22-minute drive. I've timed it dozens of times in different conditions. But something changed in the spring of 2024. Every transport I scheduled that took Highway 9 past mile marker 34 started arriving exactly 20 minutes late. Not approximately 20 minutes, exactly 20. The drivers would call in from the road, apologetic and confused, reporting mechanical trouble or unexpected delays. But when I pressed for details, their stories never quite made sense. The first incident was with Tommy Herrera, one of our most reliable drivers. He'd been running transport for 8 years without a single late delivery. Tommy called at 11:57 to report he'd be delayed on the Morrison pickup from Mercy General. "Elena, I'm sorry, but I had to pull over to check something in the back. Thought I heard rattling during the drive. Everything's secure now, but I'm running behind." "How long do you think?" 20 minutes maybe. I'll make up time where I can." He delivered at exactly 12:22 a.m., 45 minutes after pickup, instead of the usual 25. When I asked for details the next morning, Tommy seemed uncomfortable discussing it. Said the rattling had stopped when he pulled over, couldn't find anything wrong with the van or the load securement, but felt better checking anyway. 2 nights later, it was Sarah Kim with the Henderson Transport. Same route, same delay, same apologetic call about pulling over to investigate a noise from the transport bay. 20 minutes late to Morrison Funeral Home, exactly. "Did you find what was causing the sound?" I asked during her post-delivery check-in. "No, that's the weird thing. Soon as I stopped and got out, everything went quiet. But Elena, I swear something was different when I got back in the van." "Different how?" Sarah paused for a long moment before answering. The deceased Mrs. Henderson, her eyes were open when I looked through the viewing window. They'd been closed when I loaded her at the hospital. "I'm sure of it." I told Sarah that sometimes positioning shifts during transport, that facial muscles can relax or contract in ways that change expression. "It's not unusual," I said, though privately I made a note to review our loading protocols. Bodies should be properly positioned and secured to prevent movement during transit. But the delays continued. Every transport along Highway 9 that passed mile marker 34 arrived exactly 20 minutes late. Marcus Chen called in about suspension problems. Janet Morrison reported electrical issues with the refrigeration unit. David Park said he'd pulled over to check tire pressure after feeling the van pull to one side. And every single driver mentioned the same detail when I questioned them later. They glanced through the viewing window after their roadside stop, and the deceased's eyes were open. I started tracking the incidents in a spreadsheet, noting departure times, estimated arrivals, actual arrivals, and driver reports. The pattern was undeniable. 20-minute delays, without exception, for any transport that passed mile marker 34 heading south on Highway 9 between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. During day shifts, the same route ran on schedule with no problems. More troubling was the consistency of the drivers' experiences. They would hear something from the transport bay rattling, thumping, or mechanical noise that would compel them to pull over and investigate. They'd find nothing wrong with the van or the load, but when they resumed driving, a glance through the viewing window would reveal the deceased with open eyes, staring forward as if alert and aware. I researched the stretch of Highway 9 around mile marker 34, looking for accident history or construction that might explain mechanical issues with our vans. What I found was a fatality record dating back decadecimal car accidents, mostly at night, often involving vehicles that had veered off the road for no apparent reason. The most recent was in 2022. A funeral transport van from a company in the next county had crashed just past mile marker 34. The driver survived but quit the profession immediately afterward. The deceased he'd been transporting was never recovered from the wreckage. I should have rerouted all Highway 9 transports to alternate roads. Interstate 77 adds only 8 minutes to most deliveries. and State Route 42 is reliable even during late-night hours. But families expect their loved ones delivered to specific funeral homes at promised times, and changing established routes requires approval from management, explanations to drivers, and coordination with hospital loading schedules. Instead, I started warning drivers about the mile marker 34 delays. I built the extra 20 minutes into all Highway 9 schedules, telling families their loved ones would arrive later than initially estimated. The delays became routine, expected, manageable. But last Tuesday night, I decided to see mile marker 34 for myself. I drove Highway 9 southbound at 11:45 p.m., following the same route our transport vans take from Mercy General. The road was empty, except for occasional semi-truck traffic, and the mile markers ticked past in regular intervals: 38, 37, 36, 35. At mile marker 34, I felt my car's steering wheel jerk slightly to the right, as if something had grabbed the front end and tried to pull me toward the shoulder. I corrected automatically, keeping the vehicle centered in my lane, but a sound began emanating from my trunk, a rhythmic thumping, like someone knocking from inside. I pulled over onto the shoulder and got out to investigate. The trunk was empty except for emergency supplies and jumper cables. Nothing had shifted. Nothing was loose. But as I stood beside my car in the darkness, I could hear that knocking continue, not from the trunk now, but from somewhere beneath the road surface, as if someone were trapped underground and trying to signal for help. When I got back in my car, I looked automatically in the rear-view mirror, the same instinct that makes our drivers check the viewing window after their roadside stops. In the reflection, I saw someone sitting in my backseat, a pale figure in hospital clothing, staring forward through my windshield with wide, unblinking eyes. I turned around immediately, but the back seat was empty, just empty upholstery and the faint scent of antiseptic that seemed to have come from nowhere. The drive home took exactly 20 minutes longer than it should have. I've rerouted all Highway 9 transports to alternate roads now, citing ongoing construction delays in my scheduling notes. The drivers haven't questioned the change. Most of them seem relieved to avoid that stretch of road. Our delivery times are back to normal, families get their loved ones when promised, and I don't have to build mysterious delays into every late-night transport. But I still think about mile marker 34, and I wonder what happens to the transports that still use Highway 9 from other funeral homes. Whether their coordinators have noticed the same patterns, the same delays, the same reports of open eyes staring forward from viewing windows. I take Interstate 77 to work now. It's a longer drive, but some routes are worth avoiding, even when you can't fully explain why. Sometimes the dead know where they want to go better than the living do. I'm Carl Brennan, and I've been driving funeral transport for 31 years this October. Started when I was 22, fresh out of the Army, looking for steady work that didn't involve being shot at. 3 decades later, I've transported everyone from infants who never took their first breath to centenarians who outlived their own children. I know the weight of grief in a vehicle, the silence that settles over a van carrying someone's final journey, and the particular responsibility that comes with being the last person to handle the physical presence of someone who mattered to others. Most transports follow the same pattern: hospital to funeral home to cemetery, funeral home to crematorium. The addresses are programmed into dispatch tablets, routes are planned for efficiency, and timing is coordinated with receiving facilities. In 31 years, I've maybe had a dozen deliveries that deviated from scheduled mechanical problems, weather delays, traffic accidents that closed highways. Nothing dramatic, nothing that couldn't be explained in a phone call to dispatch. I work exclusively with Mercy General Hospital and their contract with Riverside Crematory Services. The route between them is 12 miles of suburban surface streets, a drive I can make in my sleep. North on Maple Avenue to the interstate on-ramp, eastbound for 7 miles, then south on Riverside Drive to the facility. 22 minutes in normal traffic, 18 minutes during night runs. I've driven it nearly 4,000 times. The pickup on September 14th should have been routine. Mrs. Dorothy Henley, 87 years old, died peacefully in her sleep after a brief stay at Mercy General. Heart failure, according to the transport manifest. Her family had chosen direct cremation or viewing. No service, just a quiet final disposition according to her documented wishes. Simple paperwork, standard body bag, and gurney setup. Everything properly secured for the drive to Riverside. I loaded Mrs. Henley into the transport van at 2:47 a.m., secured the gurney with regulation tie-down straps, and checked that the body bag zipper was properly positioned. She was a small woman, probably weighed less than 120 pounds, and the load barely registered in the van's suspension. I completed the hospital paperwork, got the release signatures from the night supervisor, and started the drive across town. The GPS unit mounted on my dashboard showed the familiar route highlighted in blue north on Maple to the interstate entrance. But as I approached the on-ramp, the device chimed softly and announced a route recalculation. The blue line shifted, directing me to continue straight on Maple instead of turning toward the highway. Recalculating route to optimize arrival time, the device announced in its calm, electronic voice. Continue straight for 2.3 miles, then turn right on Elmwood Avenue. I'd never heard the GPS recalculate to that part of town. Elmwood Avenue was residential, a quiet neighborhood of older homes that sat well away from any direct route to Riverside Crematory. But traffic optimization software gets updated regularly, and maybe construction or an accident had made the interstate route less efficient. I followed the new directions, turning right on Elmwood as instructed. The GPS guided me through increasingly narrow residential streets, past houses with dark windows and well-maintained lawns, deeper into a neighborhood I rarely visited during work hours. Left on Birch Street, right on Oakdale Drive, straight through a four-way stop at Cedar Lane. The route seemed to spiral inward, taking me farther from my destination rather than toward it. Continue straight for 400 feet, then turn left on Sycamore Street, the GPS announced. Your destination will be on the right. That's when I realized something was wrong. Riverside Crematory wasn't on Sycamore Street. It was 7 miles away on Riverside Drive, in a completely different part of town. I glanced at the dispatch tablet to confirm the delivery address, and it showed the correct information: Riverside Crematory Services, 1500 Riverside Drive. But the GPS was directing me to a residential address on Sycamore Street. I pulled over to check the system settings, but before I could touch the screen, I heard something from the transport bay, a soft sliding sound, like fabric moving across metal, the gurney straps creaking slightly under shifting weight. Bodies don't shift during transport. Properly secured remains stay in position from pickup to delivery. That's basic protocol. And I'd checked Mrs. Henley's securement myself before leaving the hospital. But the sounds continued, a rhythmic sliding noise that seemed to match the van's movement as I navigated the residential streets. I got out and walked to the rear of the van. Through the small viewing window, I could see the gurney and body bag in the dim interior light. Everything appeared normal. The straps were tight, the bag was properly positioned, and there was no visible movement. But as I watched, the entire gurney shifted slightly toward the rear doors, as if the weight distribution had somehow changed. Back in the driver's seat, I manually entered the Riverside Crematory address into the GPS, overriding whatever had caused the earlier route change. The device recalculated immediately, showing the familiar path north to the interstate, then east to Riverside Drive. But as I put the van in drive and started toward the main road, that sliding sound resumed from the transport bay, more pronounced now, accompanied by what sounded like fingernails scratching against fabric. The GPS chimed again. Recalculating route, it announced, and the blue line shifted back to the residential streets, directing me toward Sycamore Street despite my manual address entry. I canceled the route and tried again, but the same redirection occurred. The device seemed determined to guide me to a house number on Sycamore Street instead of the crematorium. By now, the sounds from the transport bay had become impossible to ignore. The sliding noise had intensified, and I could feel the van's weight distribution changing as the gurney apparently moved toward the rear doors. Every time I turned toward the main road and the correct route to Riverside, the movement became more pronounced, as if something inside the body bag was pushing against the restraints. I made a decision that broke every protocol I'd learned in 31 years of funeral transport. I followed the GPS directions to Sycamore Street. The device guided me to a vacant lot overgrown with weeds and scattered with construction debris. A weathered "For Sale" sign leaned at an angle near the sidewalk, and tire tracks in the dirt suggested contractors had been using the space for equipment storage. But according to the GPS, this was my destination, the exact address where Mrs. Dorothy Henley apparently wanted to be delivered. I parked the van and called dispatch. Unit 12 to base. I'm having navigation problems on the Henley transport. GPS is directing me to an incorrect address. Copy, Unit 12. What's your current location? Sycamore Street, residential area about 3 miles west of Riverside. The GPS keeps routing me here instead of the crematorium. There was a pause before dispatch responded. Unit 12, can you confirm the delivery address on your manifest? I read the address from my paperwork, 1500 Riverside Drive, Riverside Crematory Services. Standard information, exactly where Mrs. entered information. Henley was supposed to be delivered for cremation, according to her family's arrangements. Copy that address. Stand by while I verify the account information. While waiting for dispatch, I researched the Sycamore Street address using the van's internet connection. The property record showed it had been the site of a single-family home built in 1952 and demolished in 2019. The last recorded owner was Dorothy M. Henley, who had lived there for 43 years before moving to an assisted living facility. I was parked in front of Mrs. Henley's former home. The GPS had been trying to take her back to a house that no longer existed. The sounds from the transport bay had stopped completely. No sliding, no movement, no scratching against fabric. Through the viewing window, I could see the gurney centered and properly positioned, exactly as it should have been throughout the entire transport. The body bag lay still and undisturbed. Dispatch called back with instructions to proceed immediately to Riverside Crematory using the standard route. I reset the GPS one final time, and it calculated the correct path without any diversions or route changes. The drive took 18 minutes, exactly as it should have during a night run. When I delivered Mrs. Henley to the crematorium, the receiving technician helped me unload the gurney without any complications. The body bag showed no signs of movement or disturbance. The straps were properly secured, and the weight distribution was exactly what I'd expect for a standard transport. But as I drove the empty van back to the depot, I couldn't stop thinking about that vacant lot on Sycamore Street. How Mrs. Henley had lived there for 4 decades before age, and illness forced her into institutional care. How the GPS had known her address even though it was no longer listed in any current database. How the sounds from the transport bay had stopped the moment I'd parked in front of the place where she'd spent most of her adult life. I filed a routine maintenance request for the GPS system, citing intermittent navigation errors. The device was replaced with a newer model the following week, and I haven't had any route problems since. But sometimes, when I'm driving through residential neighborhoods on late-night transports, I find myself wondering how many of the people I carry have places they remember as home, addresses that exist in their memory but not in the world they're leaving behind. The dead, I've learned, don't always want to go where the living think they should. The name appeared in the same careful handwriting on every single transport log for 6 months before I noticed it. I'm Director Kim Nakamura, and I've been managing operations at Hillcrest Memorial Services for 9 years. Before that, I worked in hospital administration, so I understand the importance of accurate record keeping, proper documentation, and maintaining clear chains of custody for everything that moves through our facility. When families trust us with their loved ones, every detail matters. Every signature, every timestamp, every person who comes in contact with the deceased during their time in our care. Our transport logs are simple documents: driver name, departure time, destination, passenger manifest for any family members or staff who accompany the deceased, and arrival confirmation. standard industry practice, required by state regulations, and essential for insurance purposes. I review these logs weekly as part of my administrative duties, checking for completion, accuracy, and any irregularities that might need follow-up. The logs are kept in a binder at the dispatch desk, filled out by hand by our drivers before they leave for pickups or deliveries. We've talked about digitizing the system, but our 3 regular drivers, Marcus, Elena, and David, prefer the paper format, and it provides a physical backup that can't be deleted or corrupted. Old-fashioned, maybe, but reliable. Last month, while preparing our quarterly insurance audit, I pulled 6 months of transport logs to verify mileage reports and cross-reference delivery confirmations. It was routine administrative work, the kind of detail-oriented task that keeps a funeral home running smoothly but that most people never think about. Page after page of handwritten entries, departure times, destinations, all properly completed and signed. But on every single log, in the passenger manifest section, someone had written A. Shepard in careful block letters. The handwriting was consistent, neat, precise, professional. It appeared on every transport log, regardless of which driver had completed the form. Marcus's handwriting is loose and hurried. Elena writes in small cursive script, and David uses print letters that slant heavily to the right. But A. Shepard was written in the same careful block style on every single form, as if the same person had added it to each log after the drivers had completed their entries. I checked our employee records first. No one named Shepard worked for Hillcrest Memorial, and we hadn't used any contract employees or consultants with that name. I reviewed our family service records to see if any clients had a family member named A. Shepard, who might have accompanied transports, but found no matches. The passenger manifest section is supposed to list only authorized personnel family members, clergy, or funeral staff who ride along during transport. Random passengers aren't permitted, and our drivers know the liability issues involved with carrying unauthorized people. When I asked Marcus about the entries, he looked confused. A. Shepard? I don't remember writing that name on any of my logs. Are you sure it's in my handwriting? I showed him 3 of his recent transport forms, each with A. Shepard written in identical block letters that didn't match his natural script. Marcus studied them carefully, then shook his head. That's not my writing, Director Nakamura. I always complete these logs myself before leaving the facility, and I've never written that name. Elena and David gave me similar responses. Neither recognized the name or the handwriting, and both insisted they complete their logs personally without assistance from other staff members. The logs are filled out at the dispatch desk in our main hallway, visible to anyone in the building, but the driver said they'd never seen anyone else handling the paperwork. I started checking the logs more frequently, pulling them daily instead of weekly, to see if the pattern continued. Every new transport included A. Shepard in the passenger manifest, written in the same careful block letters that none of our staff could identify. The name appeared on morning pickups, afternoon deliveries, night transfers, regardless of time, destination, or driver assignment. More troubling, I began noticing that our security footage showed gaps during transport departures. We have cameras covering the loading dock where our vans are parked, and the system is supposed to record continuously 24 hours a day. But when I reviewed footage from recent departures, I found 20-minute segments of blank recording during the time when each van left the facility. Not static, not interference, just complete gaps in the recording, as if the cameras had been turned off or blocked. The timestamps showed normal progression, but the actual footage was missing. 20 minutes of blank space during every single transport departure, regardless of which camera angle I checked. I called our security company to inspect the system. The technician found no mechanical problems, no evidence of tampering, and no explanation for the recording gaps. System looks fine, he told me. Maybe power fluctuations or electrical interference, but everything tests normal now. But the gaps continued. 20 minutes of missing footage every time a transport van left Hillcrest Memorial, and A. Shepard, written on every log in handwriting that no one could identify. Last Tuesday, I decided to watch a departure in person instead of relying on security footage. Marcus was scheduled for a pickup at Mercy General at 10:15 a.m., and I positioned myself in the loading dock area 10 minutes before his departure time. I brought the transport log with me, freshly printed and blank except for Marcus's pre-departure information. Marcus completed his vehicle inspection, loaded his equipment, and walked over to the dispatch desk to finish his paperwork. I watched him write his name, the departure time, and the destination address in his characteristic hurried script. The passenger manifest section remained empty. No family members or staff would be accompanying this pickup. "All set, Director Nakamura," Marcus said, handing me the completed form. "Should be back by 11:30. I reviewed the log immediately. Everything was properly filled out, all required fields complete, Marcus's signature at the bottom. The passenger manifest section showed only the standard N.A. notation indicating no passengers. Marcus started the van and began backing out of the loading dock. I watched him maneuver onto the street and disappear around the corner, noting the time as 10:17 a.m. Then I looked down at the transport log in my hands. A. Shepard was written in the passenger manifest section in those same careful block letters. I stared at the paper, certain I'd been holding it continuously since Marcus handed it to me. The ink looked fresh, as if someone had just finished writing it, but I hadn't seen anyone approach the desk or touch the form. The handwriting was identical to every other entry I'd found over the past 6 months. Neat, precise, professional. When Marcus returned from his pickup, I asked him to look at his completed log. He studied the passenger manifest section with growing confusion. "Director Nakamura, I didn't write this name. I wrote N.A. for no passengers, same as always. I'm sure of it." I showed him the form I'd been holding since his departure, with A. Shepard written in block letters that didn't match his handwriting. Marcus examined it closely, then looked at me with an expression I'd never seen from him before, not just confusion, but something approaching fear. "Someone else wrote this while I was gone," he said quietly, "but who would have access to the form after I signed it? I've been keeping the transport logs locked in my office now, reviewing them immediately upon each driver's return. But A. Shepard continues to appear on every single form, written in that same careful handwriting that no one recognizes. The security footage still shows 20-minute gaps during every departure, and I haven't found any explanation for either phenomenon. Yesterday, I decided to research the name itself, wondering if it might be connected to our facility's history. In the county records, I found a death certificate from 2017 for an Alice Shepard, age 74, who died at Mercy General Hospital. She was transported to Hillcrest Memorial by our service and cremated according to her family's wishes. But according to our own records, Alice Shepard's transport 6 years ago was the only time that name ever appeared in our logs until 6 months ago, when A. Shepard began appearing on every single form. I don't know who A. Shepard is, or why that name keeps appearing in our transport logs in handwriting that none of my staff recognizes. I don't know why our security cameras stop recording for exactly 20 minutes during every departure, or what happens during those gaps in surveillance. What I do know is that someone or something has been riding along on every transport from Hillcrest Memorial for the past 6 months, and I have no idea where they go when the vans reach their destinations. She was always waiting at mile marker 127, and she always waved goodbye. I'm Jake Morrison, and I drive weekend transport for Mercy General Hospital's contract services. Been doing it for 3 years now, ever since I needed extra income to help with my daughter's college tuition. Friday evenings through Sunday nights, I handle the transfers that the regular weekday drivers don't cover, mostly deliveries to funeral homes, crematoriums, and the occasional transfer to the county morgue for autopsies that can wait until Monday. It's quiet work, which suits me fine. I spent 22 years driving long-haul trucking before my back gave out, so I'm comfortable with solitude, familiar with the rhythm of highway driving, and experienced enough to handle a vehicle safely in any weather conditions. The funeral transport van is smaller than the 18-wheelers I used to drive. but the responsibility feels heavier. These aren't cargo loads or freight shipments, they're people making their final journey, and that deserves respect and careful attention. My regular Saturday morning route takes me from Mercy General to 3 different funeral homes across 2 counties, usually starting around 6 a.m. and finishing by early afternoon. The longest leg is the drive to Riverside Memorial, which requires 43 miles on Interstate 75 heading north. It's a straight, well-maintained stretch of highway that I can drive almost automatically, passing through farm country and small towns that most travelers never notice. Mile marker 127 sits between 2 rolling hills, about halfway through the drive to Riverside Memorial. There's nothing distinctive about that section of Interstatino exit ramps, no rest areas, no landmarks that would make it memorable. Just 4 lanes of asphalt cutting through rural countryside, with a concrete guardrail separating the northbound lanes from a steep embankment that drops down to a creek. The first time I saw her was on a Saturday morning in early October of 2023. I was transporting an elderly man who died peacefully at Mercy General, delivering him to Riverside for a family viewing later that day. The traffic was light, the weather clear, and I was maintaining steady speed in the right lane when I noticed a figure standing behind the guardrail at mile marker 127. She was an elderly woman, probably in her 70s, wearing a standard hospital gown that fluttered slightly in the wind from passing vehicles. Her gray hair was uncombed, and she stood perfectly still except for one slow, deliberate wave as my van passed. Not the frantic gesture of someone seeking help, but a calm, almost formal farewell, like she was seeing off a departing friend. I checked my mirrors immediately, concerned that someone had wandered away from a medical facility or needed assistance. But by the time I could safely slow down and look back, she was gone. No figure by the guardrail, no sign that anyone had been there. I considered calling it in to Highway Patrol, but without being certain of what I'd seen, and with no evidence of anyone needing help, I continued to Riverside Memorial and made a note to watch for her on future trips. She was there the following Saturday. Same location, same hospital gown, same slow wave as I passed mile marker 127. This time I was transporting a middle-aged woman who died of complications from surgery, and I paid closer attention to the figure by the guardrail. She appeared to be looking directly at my van as it approached, and her wave seemed intentional, purposeful, as if she recognized the vehicle or understood its purpose. Again, when I checked my mirrors after passing, she had vanished completely. By the 3rd Saturday, I started expecting to see her. Mile marker 127 became a point of focus during my drive to Riverside Memorial, and I found myself checking the guardrail area several hundred yards before reaching it. She was always their same position, same hospital gown, same deliberate wave. But something else had started happening that I couldn't initially explain. When I glanced in my rearview mirror after passing the woman, the transport bay looked different. Not dramatically, but in subtle ways that made me question what I was seeing. The body bag seemed to be positioned slightly differently on the gurney, as if the deceased had shifted or turned during transport. Sometimes an arm appeared to be raised beneath the covering. Sometimes the head seemed angled toward the rear windows. Bodies don't move during transport. Rigor mortis, proper positioning, and secure strapping ensure that remains stay exactly as positioned during loading. But every Saturday, after passing mile marker 127 and the waving woman, my mirror showed changes in the transport bay that shouldn't have been possible. The 4th Saturday was when I realized what I was seeing. I was carrying an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, who died at Mercy General after a brief illness. As usual, the woman in the hospital gown was standing at mile marker 127, and she waved as I passed. But this time, when I checked my rearview mirror, I could see that Mrs. Patterson's body had turned toward the rear windows, and her arm was raised beneath the body bag covering, positioned exactly like a return wave. I pulled over at the next rest area and walked back to check the transport bay through the viewing window. Mrs. Patterson was properly positioned on the gurney, lying flat with her arms at her sides, exactly as she'd been loaded at the hospital. The body bag showed no signs of movement or disturbance. Everything appeared normal and secure. But I knew what I'd seen in the mirror. The deceased in my transport bay had been waving back at the woman by the guardrail, as if they recognized each other, as if some form of communication was passing between them. The pattern continued every Saturday for 2 months. The woman at mile marker 127 would wave as I passed, and the deceased in my transport bay would appear to wave back when I checked my mirrors. Different people, different ages, different causes of death, but the same inexplicable interaction occurred with every transport. I started researching the area around mile marker 127, looking for accident records, missing persons reports, or historical incidents that might explain a persistent presence at that location. The State Highway Department had no records of fatal accidents in that specific area, and local law enforcement hadn't received any reports of a confused elderly woman wandering near the interstate. But I did find something in the archived records of a small community hospital that had operated 20 miles east of mile marker 127. Hillside General Hospital had closed in 2019 after serving rural communities for 53 years. During its final week of operation, an elderly patient named Agnes Shepard had walked out of the facility wearing only her hospital gown and was never found. She'd been suffering from advanced dementia and was scheduled for transfer to a long-term care facility when she disappeared. Agnes Shepard was 74 years old when she vanished. According to the missing person report, she had gray hair, stood about 5 feet 4 inches tall, and was last seen wearing a standard hospital gown. Last Saturday, I decided to test something that had been troubling me for weeks. Instead of taking Interstate 75 to Riverside Memorial, I used an alternate route that avoided mile marker 127 entirely. State Route 43 adds about 15 minutes to the drive, but it bypasses the interstate completely, following back roads through the same rural area. I was transporting a man named Robert Chen, who died unexpectedly of a heart attack. The alternate route took me through small farming communities, past fields and woodlands that looked nothing like the interstate landscape. But as I crested a hill about halfway through the drive, I found myself approaching a familiar concrete guardrail and a green sign that read, Mile Marker 127. Agnes Shepard was standing behind the guardrail in her hospital gown, waving as my van passed. I looked around in confusion, trying to understand how I'd ended up at mile marker 127 when I was supposed to be on State Route 43. The road signs showed the correct route numbers. The landscape looked like rural farmland rather than interstate corridor. But there was the unmistakable mile marker and the woman who'd been appearing in the same location every Saturday for months. When I checked my rearview mirror, Robert Chen's body had turned toward the rear windows of the transport bay, his arm raised beneath the covering in what could only be described as a farewell wave. I don't take Interstate 75 to Riverside Memorial anymore. I use State Route 43, even though it adds time to every delivery, and families sometimes complain about delayed arrivals. But it doesn't matter which route I choose, I still pass mile marker 127, Agnes Shepard still waves goodbye, and the deceased still wave back from my transport bay. I've learned to accept that some roads lead to the same destination, regardless of which path you think you're taking. And some people wait at the same place to see others safely on their way, even when they should have moved on long ago themselves. The refrigeration unit in Transport Van 3 kept recording the temperature of life in a compartment that only carried the dead. I'm Supervisor Patricia Wells, and I've been managing fleet operations for regional transport services for 14 years. Before this job, I spent 8 years as an EMT, so I understand both sides of emergency response, the frantic effort to save lives, and the quiet dignity required when those efforts fail. My current position involves maintaining our fleet of specialized transport vehicles, ensuring compliance with health department regulations, and reviewing the digital logs that track every aspect of our operations. Our transport vans are equipped with sophisticated climate control systems that maintain precise temperatures during the movement of deceased individuals from hospitals to funeral homes, crematoriums, and medical examiner facilities. The refrigeration units are calibrated to hold steady temperatures between 36 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, with digital sensors that record readings every 30 seconds. These logs are essential for maintaining chain of custody documentation and ensuring that we meet all regulatory requirements for the dignified transport of the deceased. Each morning, I download the overnight temperature data from our 3 transport vans, reviewing the logs for any irregularities that might indicate equipment problems or maintenance needs. Normal operations show steady temperature, curves gradual cooling when a transport bay is loaded, stable maintenance during travel, and gradual warming when the bay is empty. Consistent patterns, predictable data, nothing that requires special attention. But 3 months ago, I started noticing anomalies in the logs from Transport Van 3. Brief temperature spikes that appeared during certain transports, moments where the interior temperature would suddenly jump from the normal 38 degrees to exactly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Human body temperature. The spikes were brief, lasting only a few minutes before the system returned to normal cooling patterns, but they were precise and unmistakable in the digital records. Equipment malfunctions usually show random temperature variations or gradual system failures. These spikes were different, sharp, consistent increases to a very specific temperature that had no mechanical explanation. Refrigeration systems don't suddenly generate heat, and there was no external source that could raise the interior temperature of a properly sealed transport bay to exactly body temperature. I initially assumed the spikes represented sensor malfunctions or data corruption, but when I cross-referenced the temperature anomalies with our transport records, I discovered a disturbing pattern. Every temperature spike occurred during the transport of accident, victims people who had died from traumatic injuries sustained in car crashes, falls, or other sudden incidents. The spikes never occurred during transports of individuals who had died from natural causes, illness, or age-related conditions. More troubling, the duration of each temperature spike was identical, 4 minutes and 27 seconds. Every single anomaly lasted exactly the same length of time, regardless of the transport distance, the time of day, or which driver was operating the van. 4 minutes and 27 seconds of 98.6 degree temperature readings, then an immediate return to normal refrigeration levels. I contacted our equipment manufacturer to report the sensor irregularities, and they sent a technician to inspect Transport Van 3. He found no mechanical problems with the refrigeration system, no sensor malfunctions, and no explanation for the temperature data I'd been recording. The system tested normally under all operating conditions. These units are pretty straightforward, the technician told me. Temperature sensors either work or they don't. If you're getting consistent readings, the equipment is probably functioning correctly. But 98.6 degrees in a refrigerated transport bay doesn't make sense unless something alive is generating body heat. Something alive. The phrase stayed with me as I continued monitoring the temperature logs from all 3 transport vans. Van 1 and Van 2 showed normal pattern steady cooling curves, stable maintenance temperatures, gradual warming when empty. But Van 3 continued registering those impossible spikes during accident victim transports. 4 minutes and 27 seconds of body temperature readings in a compartment that should have been maintaining near freezing conditions. I decided to research the significance of that specific time duration. 4 minutes and 27 seconds seemed too precise to be random, and if the temperature spikes were somehow connected to the accident victims being transported, perhaps the timing related to their original emergency circumstances. Using our transport records, I cross-referenced the temperature spike data with emergency response reports from the accidents that had killed each victim. Most emergency services maintain detailed logs of response times, from the initial call to the arrival of first responders at the scene. What I discovered made me question everything I thought I understood about death and the measurement of time. 4 minutes and 27 seconds was the average time it had taken paramedics to reach each accident victim while they were still alive. Not the exact time for each individual case, but the mathematical average across all the accident scenes. Some paramedics had arrived in 3 minutes. Others took 6 or 7 minutes depending on location and traffic conditions. But when I calculated the mean response time for every accident victim who later caused temperature spikes in Transport Van 3, the average was 4 minutes and 27 seconds. The refrigeration system was somehow recording the precise duration that each accident victim had waited for help to arrive, recreating those final minutes of hope and struggle in a compartment where hope no longer mattered. I started timing the temperature spikes more carefully, noting when they began during each transport, and checking if there were any external factors that might trigger them. The spikes didn't correlate with departure times, arrival times, or specific locations along transport routes. They seemed to occur randomly during the journey, with no predictable pattern, except their consistent duration and the fact that they only happened during accident victim transports. Last Tuesday, I decided to ride along during a transport that I suspected would trigger a temperature spike. We were moving a 34-year-old construction worker named Michael Torres, who had died in a workplace fall. According to the emergency response logs, paramedics had taken 4 minutes and 18 seconds to reach him after the accident was reported. I sat in the passenger seat of Transport Van 3, while our driver, Carlos, made the routine journey from Memorial Hospital to the county medical examiner's office. I had a tablet connected to the refrigeration system, monitoring the temperature readings in real time as we traveled through the city. 23 minutes into the transport, the temperature began to rise. I watched the digital display climb from 38 degrees to 50 degrees, then 70 degrees, then 90 degrees in a matter of seconds. The rise was smooth and steady, like watching a fever develop in real time. At 98.6 degrees, the temperature stabilized and held steady. But something else was happening that I hadn't anticipated. I could hear sounds from the transport bay, not mechanical noises from the refrigeration system, but something that sounded like breathing. Rapid, shallow breaths like someone fighting for air, punctuated by what might have been whispered words too quiet to understand. Carlos noticed it too. "Supervisor Wells, do you hear that? Sounds like there's someone back there." I told Carlos to pull over so we could check the transport bay, but as soon as we stopped the van, the sounds ceased immediately. The temperature reading dropped back to normal refrigeration levels, and the digital log showed exactly 4 minutes and 27 seconds of elevated temperature, longer than Michael Torres had actually waited for paramedics, but matching the average duration I'd calculated across all accident victims. When we opened the transport bay to investigate, everything appeared normal. Michael Torres was properly positioned on the gurney. The body bag showed no signs of movement or disturbance, and the interior of the compartment felt appropriately cold. But I noticed something that made me check the transport manifest again. The paperwork listed Michael Torres's time of death as occurring 4 minutes and 18 seconds after the workplace accident was reported. But for 4 minutes and 27 seconds during our transport, the refrigeration system had recorded the temperature of a living body, and we had heard the sounds of someone fighting to stay alive. I've requested that Transport Van 3 be retired from service, citing ongoing equipment irregularities that pose potential regulatory compliance issues. Management approved the request without asking for technical details, and the van has been moved to our maintenance facility where it sits unused. But I still review the temperature logs from our remaining transport vans every morning, and I've started noticing similar anomalies in Van 2 during certain accident victim transports. Brief spikes to 98.6 degrees, lasting precisely as long as it took help to arrive when arrival still mattered. I don't know why our refrigeration systems are recording these echoes of emergency response times, or why the transport of accident victims seems to trigger temperature readings that shouldn't be possible in compartments carrying only the dead. But I've learned that some measurements capture more than just the physical conditions of the moment. They also record the duration of hope, the length of struggle, and the exact amount of time someone spent waiting for help that arrived too late to matter. The dead have been calling in their own accidents for 3 months now, and dispatch keeps asking for backup that will never arrive. I'm Tommy Castellanos, and I drive rural transport routes for Valley Memorial Services, covering the back roads and small communities that connect 3 counties in central Pennsylvania. Been doing this job for 7 years, ever since I moved here from Philadelphia looking for quieter work and cleaner air. The rural routes suit me: fineless traffic, prettier scenery, and the kind of driving where you can think without constantly watching for hazards. My territory includes Millbrook Valley, a stretch of winding country roads that follows an old creek bed through farmland and patches of forest that haven't changed much in 50 years. It's peaceful country, the kind of place where you might see deer crossing the road or hawks circling overhead, where the biggest traffic concern is getting stuck behind a tractor during planting season. The communities out there are small, a few hundred people scattered across townships, with names like Pine Creek, Cedar Mills, and Harmony Ridge. Most of my transports through Millbrook Valley are routine pickups from the small rural hospital that serves those communities, delivering to funeral homes in the larger towns along the interstate. The drive takes about 45 minutes each way, following Route 27 through the valley, past farms and woodlots, over old stone bridges that cross streams too small to have names. I make the run maybe 3 times a week, usually during day shifts when the road conditions are best and visibility is good. I keep the radio on during long drives, mostly for company, and to stay current with any traffic or weather conditions that might affect my route. The van's radio picks up several frequencies: local police, county emergency services, state highway patrol, and the usual commercial AM and FM stations. Rural areas can have spotty reception, and sometimes the signals drift or pick up transmissions from distant cities. But generally the radio provides reliable background noise during solitary drives through empty countryside. 3 months ago, during a transport through Millbrook Valley, I started hearing police dispatch calls that didn't make sense. The first one came through clearly while I was driving past the old Miller farm, about 15 minutes into the valley route. A dispatcher's voice, professional and calm, reporting a motor vehicle accident with injuries. Unit 12, respond to intersection of Valley Road and Maple Street for reported 2-car collision with possible fatalities. 1978 Chevrolet Nova versus 1976 Ford pickup truck. I was transporting an elderly man named Harold Winters, who died at the rural hospital, taking him to Morrison Funeral Home in the county seat. But what struck me about the dispatch call was the specificity of the vehicle descriptions model years from the 1970s and the location. I'd driven through Millbrook Valley hundreds of times, and I'd never seen an intersection called Valley Road and Maple Street. The radio crackled with additional units responding to the scene, ambulance dispatches, and requests for traffic control. Standard emergency protocols. Nothing unusual about the procedures or the language used. But the vehicles described in subsequent transmissions were all from decades past Plymouth Satellites, Dodge Darts, Oldsmobile Cutlass Eskers that you rarely see on modern roads. I checked my transport manifest to confirm the details of my current delivery. Harold Winters, aged 74, died of complications from pneumonia at Millbrook Valley General Hospital. But as the radio chatter continued, I heard something that made me pull over to the shoulder. Dispatch, we have a confirmed fatality in the Nova. Male, approximately 74 years old. Need coroner notification and next of kin contact for Harold Winters. The dispatcher was reporting the death of the man I was currently transporting, describing an accident that apparently happened decades earlier, involving a 1978 Chevrolet Nova at an intersection that didn't exist on any current road maps. I turned off the radio immediately, thinking I'd stumbled onto some kind of emergency services training exercise or historical recreation. But the silence in the van felt heavier than usual, and I found myself checking the rearview mirror more frequently during the remainder of the drive to Morrison Funeral Home. The following week, during another transport through Millbrook Valley, the radio picked up similar dispatch calls. This time, I was carrying Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, an 81-year-old woman who died peacefully in her sleep at the rural hospital. 20 minutes into the Valley Drive, dispatch reported a single-car accident involving a 1982 Buick Century that had apparently left the road near Pine Creek Bridge. Unit 7. Elderly female driver appears to have suffered medical emergency before impact. No other vehicles involved. Fatality confirmed. Identification shows Eleanor Patterson, age 81. I was hearing emergency dispatch calls describing the death of the person I was transporting, reported as accident scenes that had occurred years or decades earlier, at times when the deceased would have been much younger and presumably still driving the vehicles described in the radio chatter. Over the next several weeks, the pattern continued. Every transport through Millbrook Valley triggered radio transmissions describing fatal accidents involving the specific person I was carrying. The dispatches always described older vehicles, intersections with names I couldn't locate on current maps, and emergency responses that seemed to be occurring in real time, despite referencing events that must have happened years in the past. More disturbing, I began to research the accidents described in the radio calls, checking county records and newspaper archives for fatal crashes in the Millbrook Valley area. What I found was that many of the people I'd transported had indeed died in car accidents, but not recently, and not in the circumstances described by the emergency dispatches. Harold Winters, for example, had died in a car accident in 1978, not from pneumonia at the hospital. Eleanor Patterson had been killed in a single-car crash near Pine Creek Bridge in 1982, not from natural causes in her sleep. The radio was somehow picking up the original emergency dispatch calls from the actual accidents that had killed these people decades earlier. But they were all being delivered to funeral homes as natural deaths, with hospital death certificates listing medical causes rather than traumatic injuries. Either the records were wrong, or something more disturbing was happening with the circumstances of these deaths. Last Tuesday, I decided to drive through Millbrook Valley with the radio turned off completely, hoping to avoid the unsettling dispatch calls. I was transporting a middle-aged man named Robert Chen, who, according to his death certificate, had died of a heart attack at the rural hospital. The radio remained silent during the first half of the journey, and I began to think I'd solved the problem by simply eliminating the source of the mysterious transmissions. But as I approached the area where Pine Creek Bridge crosses the old stone culvert, I began hearing dispatch calls, again not from the radio, which was completely turned off, but from somewhere inside the van itself. The voices were coming from the transport compartment, muffled but clearly audible through the partition that separates the driver's area from the rear of the van. The same professional dispatcher tones, the same emergency protocols, but now describing a motor vehicle accident involving a 2015 Honda Civic that had apparently struck a bridge abutment at high speed. Unit 4. Single occupant vehicle. Male driver appears to have suffered cardiac event before impact. Confirmed fatality. Identification shows Robert Chen, age 48. I pulled over immediately and walked around to the rear of the van, pressing my ear against the transport bay doors. The dispatch calls were definitely coming from inside the compartment, describing the death of Robert Chen in a car accident that had apparently occurred years before his supposed natural death at the hospital. When I opened the transport bay to investigate, everything appeared normal. Robert Chen was properly positioned on the gurney. The body bag showed no signs of disturbance, and there was no radio equipment or electronic device that could be generating the voice transmissions. But I could still hear them faint emergency radio chatter describing accident scenes, casualty reports, and requests for coroner services. I've stopped accepting transport assignments through Millbrook Valley. When dispatch asks about my availability for rural routes, I cite vehicle maintenance issues or scheduling conflicts. The other drivers have picked up those runs without any complaints, and I haven't asked them about radio reception problems in that area. But I still think about those dispatch calls, and I wonder how many people who supposedly die of natural causes in small rural hospitals actually died years earlier in accidents that were somehow erased from official records, leaving only the radio echoes of emergency responses that nobody alive remembers receiving. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving empty transport routes through other rural areas, I catch fragments of emergency dispatch calls on my radio brief transmissions describing accidents that might have happened decades ago, casualties whose names I might recognize if I checked my future transport manifests. I've learned to turn off the radio before those voices can tell me who I'll be carrying next. Sometimes the dead leave messages for people who can no longer receive them. I'm Maria Santos, and I work as lead transport technician for Riverside Memorial Services, coordinating the movement of deceased individuals between hospitals, funeral homes, and burial sites across 3 counties. I've been in this position for 11 years, ever since I completed my certification in mortuary transport operations. Before this job, I worked as a medical assistant, so I understand both the clinical and compassionate aspects of death care, the importance of following protocols, while maintaining dignity for families during their most difficult moments. My responsibilities include scheduling transport routes, ensuring proper documentation, and occasionally driving when we're short-staffed or dealing with complex logistics. I know every cemetery, funeral home, and crematorium in our service area, along with the most efficient routes between them. These aren't just addresses to me, they're destinations where families say final goodbyes, where decades of marriage end, where parents bury children and children bury parents. Every transport carries emotional weight that extends far beyond the physical movement of remains. Our vehicles are equipped with standard GPS navigation systems that calculate optimal routes based on real-time traffic conditions, road construction, and distance. The units are updated regularly with current maps and points of interest, and they've proven reliable over thousands of successful transports. Occasionally, we encounter minor glitches, outdated road information, or temporary construction zones that haven't been entered into the database, but nothing that significantly affects our operations or delivery schedules. Last Thursday, I was handling a transport from Mercy General Hospital to St. Mary's Cemetery, a routine burial delivery that I'd made dozens of times before. The deceased was Walter Morrison, 78 years old, who had died peacefully after a long illness. His family had arranged for burial in the section of St. Mary's where his wife had been interred 3 years earlier. Standard arrangements, proper documentation, everything properly coordinated with the cemetery staff. I loaded Mr. Morrison into transport van number 2, secured the gurney according to protocol, and started the 26-minute drive to St. Mary's Cemetery. The route was familiar: north on Industrial Boulevard, east on Highway 42, then south on Cemetery Road to the main entrance. I'd driven it so many times I could probably navigate it without GPS assistance, but I kept the system active for traffic updates and estimated arrival times. 15 minutes into the drive, the GPS announced a route recalculation. The voice directed me to take the next exit instead of continuing on Highway 42, routing me toward what appeared to be an alternate path to the cemetery. I'd never taken that particular route before, but GPS systems occasionally identify more efficient paths based on current traffic patterns, so I followed the new directions without concern. The alternate route led me through a residential area I rarely visited, past older homes and small businesses that looked like they'd been established decades earlier. The streets were narrower than the main highways I usually traveled, lined with mature trees and older-style street lamps. It felt like driving through a neighborhood that time had left mostly unchanged, where the pace of life moved more slowly than in the commercial districts near the hospitals and funeral homes. The GPS guided me to turn right onto Elm Street, then left onto a road called Sunset Avenue. I didn't recognize either street name, despite my familiarity with the area, but rural counties often have small residential roads that don't appear on commonly used maps. The route seemed to be spiraling toward the cemetery through back roads that avoided the main traffic corridors. In 500 feet, turn left into Marathon Gas Station, the GPS announced. You have reached your destination. That instruction made no sense. I was supposed to be delivering Mr. Morrison to St. Mary's Cemetery, not stopping at a gas station. I glanced at the GPS screen to check if I'd entered the wrong destination address, but the display clearly showed St. Mary's Cemetery as my intended endpoint. The system seemed to be malfunctioning, directing me to a commercial stop that had nothing to do with my scheduled burial delivery. But as I approached the location indicated by the GPS, I could see that there was no Marathon gas station at the coordinates. The address led to an empty lot overgrown with weeds and scattered with old concrete foundations and rusted metal debris. A weathered "For Lease" sign leaned against a chain-link fence that enclosed the vacant property, and tire tracks in the gravel suggested that contractors occasionally used the space for equipment storage. I pulled into the empty lot, planning to recalibrate the GPS and manually enter the correct address for St. Mary's Cemetery. But as I parked the van, I noticed that the tire tracks in the gravel looked fresh, deep impressions in the loose stones that suggested a vehicle had been there recently. The tracks formed a pattern that looked like someone had pulled in, stopped for several minutes, then backed out and left. When I stepped out of the van to check my bearings and look for street signs that might help me determine my location, I found a folded piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper on the driver's side. It was a handwritten note on plain white paper, written in careful cursive script with blue ink. "Tell my daughter I made it safely. Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't be there when she needed me most. Tell her I love her, and I'm proud of the woman she became." The note was signed Walter Morrison in the same careful handwriting. I stood in that empty lot, holding a handwritten message from the man whose body I was transporting. A note that had somehow appeared on my windshield during the few minutes I'd been parked at the coordinates where a gas station should have been but wasn't. Walter Morrison was in the transport bay, properly secured and certainly incapable of writing notes or placing them on vehicle windshields. But the handwriting looked genuine. The message was personal and specific, and the signature matched the name on my transport manifest. I walked around the empty lot, looking for any explanation of how the note had appeared on my van. There were no other vehicles in the area, no pedestrians, no buildings where someone could have been watching and waiting for me to arrive. Just vacant land surrounded by residential neighborhoods with no apparent connection to Walter Morrison or St. Mary's Cemetery. Using my phone, I researched the address where the GPS had directed me. The property record showed that a Marathon gas station had operated at that location from 1986 until 2008, when it was demolished due to underground fuel tank contamination. The lot had remained empty since the building was torn down 15 years earlier. More troubling, when I searched for information about Walter Morrison's family, I discovered that his daughter, Jennifer, had died in a car accident at the intersection of Elm Street and Sunset Avenue in 2009. According to the accident report, her vehicle had been struck by a drunk driver while she was returning from her job at the Marathon gas station that had stood on the lot where I was currently parked. Jennifer Morrison had been 26 years old when she died, just 1 year after the gas station where she worked was demolished and the lot became vacant. The accident had occurred at the intersection I'd just driven through, following GPS directions that had led me to the exact spot where her father's final message was waiting to be delivered. I sat in my van for nearly 20 minutes, holding Walter Morrison's handwritten note and trying to understand how it had appeared on my windshield. The man who'd supposedly written it was in my transport bay, and his daughter, who was supposed to receive the message, had been dead for 14 years. But the note felt real in my hands. The handwriting looked authentic, and the message contained the kind of personal sentiment that only a father would express to his child. Eventually, I recalibrated the GPS and drove to St. Mary's Cemetery, where I completed the burial delivery according to schedule. The cemetery staff helped me unload Walter Morrison's body, and the graveside service proceeded normally. His surviving relatives attended the burial, but none of them mentioned a daughter named Jennifer, and I didn't feel appropriate asking about family members who might have preceded him in death. I kept Walter Morrison's handwritten note in my desk drawer for 2 weeks before deciding what to do with it. Finally, I drove back to the intersection of Elm Street and Sunset Avenue, where Jennifer Morrison had died in 2009. There's a small memorial garden there now, maintained by the city as a traffic safety reminder, with a bench and flowering bushes that bloom each spring. I left the note under a stone on Jennifer Morrison's memorial bench, where it could serve as her father's final message, even if she was no longer able to receive it. Whether she somehow guided my GPS to that vacant lot, or whether Walter Morrison's spirit found a way to leave one last expression of love, I'll never know. But I've learned that some destinations aren't marked on any current maps, and sometimes the most important deliveries are messages that arrive decades too late to change anything except the knowledge that love persists even when the people who shared it are gone. I stopped looking at the transport photos 6 weeks ago, but I still file them every morning in a folder I never open. I'm Frank DeMarco, night shift supervisor for Metropolitan Transport Services, and I've been managing overnight funeral transport operations for 16 years. During that time, I've overseen thousands of transfers, handled every kind of logistical challenge, and developed protocols that ensure smooth operations when regular management isn't available. The night shift is different from day operations, fewer staff, longer response times if problems arise, and the particular responsibility that comes with being the senior person on duty when families are trusting us with their most precious cargo. Our transport crews work with minimal supervision during overnight hours, covering hospital pickups, funeral home deliveries, and emergency transfers that can't wait for morning. Most of our drivers are experienced professionals who've been doing this work for years, but I instituted additional documentation procedures after a few incidents where families questioned whether their loved ones had been handled with proper care during transport. Nothing serious concerns about positioning, clothing adjustments, or minor cosmetic issues that might have occurred during loading or unloading. To address these concerns and protect both our drivers and the families we serve, I implemented a policy requiring photographic documentation of every transport. Before loading the deceased, drivers must photograph the body as positioned by hospital or funeral home staff. After securing the load in the transport bay, they take another photo showing proper placement and restraint. Upon arrival at the destination, they photograph the transport bay before unloading, and again after the deceased has been transferred to the receiving facility. The documentation serves multiple purposes: proof of proper handling, evidence of any pre-existing conditions or positioning concerns, and a record that can be referenced if questions arise about the transport process. Insurance companies appreciate the thoroughness. Families feel reassured that their loved ones are being treated with dignity, and drivers have protection against any allegations of mishandling. Each morning, when I arrive to begin the day shift transition, I download the previous night's photos from our drivers' tablets and file them in transport records for each case. Standard administrative work, similar to reviewing paperwork or checking vehicle logs. The photos are typically routine images of the deceased properly positioned on gurneys, secured in transport bays, and transferred without incident to their destinations. But about 3 months ago, I started noticing subtle differences between the before and after photos that I couldn't explain. The changes were small at first: slight shifts in hand position, minor adjustments in head angle, variations in how clothing lay across the body. Nothing dramatic, nothing that suggested rough handling or transport problems, but differences that shouldn't have occurred during routine transfers. Bodies positioned for transport are secured with straps and positioning devices that prevent movement during travel. Professional preparation ensures that remains stay exactly as positioned until they reach their destination. I initially attributed the variations to photographic angles or lighting differences. Drivers might take pictures from slightly different positions, or interior lighting in the transport bays could create shadows that made positioning appear different between shots. But as I reviewed more photos over several weeks, the pattern became impossible to ignore. In the after photos, the deceased's hands were consistently positioned differently than they'd been in the before images. Sometimes hands that had been at the person's sides were folded across their chest in a prayer position. Sometimes arms that had been properly arranged were reaching upward, as if the person were trying to sit up or reach towards something. Most disturbing, in several photos, the deceased appeared to be reaching directly toward the camera, with fingers extended as if trying to touch whoever was taking the picture. I started comparing the photos more systematically, printing before and after images for side-by-side analysis. The differences were undeniable. Every transport showed some variation in hand positioning, and the variations always suggested deliberate, purposeful movement rather than random shifting that might occur due to vehicle vibration or improper securing. When I asked our drivers about the positioning changes, they seemed genuinely puzzled. Marcus, who's been driving for us for 8 years, looked at his photos with obvious confusion. Mr. DeMarco, I secure everybody the same way, following the exact same protocol. These hands weren't folded when I loaded this person at the hospital, and they weren't folded when I took the post-loading photo. But look at this delivery shot-perfect prayer position, like someone arranged them that way during the drive. Elena had similar experiences. I've been checking the transport bay every time I stop for gas or food, making sure nothing has shifted or come loose. Never seen any movement, never had to readjust anything. But these photos show changes that I swear weren't there when I made my visual checks. David showed me a particularly unsettling set of images from a transport the previous week. The deceased, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, had been photographed at the hospital with her arms at her sides, properly positioned and secured. The post-loading photo showed the same arrangement. But the pre-delivery photo taken outside the funeral home showed Mrs. Patterson with both arms raised toward the roof of the transport bay, fingers extended as if she were trying to push her way out. I opened the bay to check before unloading her, David told me. Everything was normal, arms at her sides, exactly like when I picked her up. But this photo shows something completely different, and I took it maybe 2 minutes before I opened the doors. I began riding along on transports to observe the process firsthand, thinking that direct supervision might reveal what was causing the positioning changes. But during the 3 runs I accompanied, I never saw any movement or disturbance in the transport bays. The deceased remained properly positioned throughout each journey, secured and motionless as expected. Yet the photos continued to show the same impossible variations. Before images with hands at sides, after images with hands in prayer. Before images with arms properly arranged, after images reaching toward the camera. The breaking point came 5 weeks ago during a routine delivery to Riverside Funeral Home. I was reviewing photos from a transport driven by Sarah, one of our most careful and experienced drivers. The deceased was a middle-aged man named Robert Chen, who had died unexpectedly of a heart attack. The before photos showed proper positioning, arms at sides, hands resting naturally, body centered on the gurney. But the after photo showed Mr. Chen sitting upright on the gurney, both arms extended toward the camera, his face turned directly toward the lens, as if he were looking at whoever was taking the picture. I stared at that image for nearly 10 minutes, trying to find some rational explanation. Bodies don't sit up during transport. Rigor mortis, proper securing, and basic physics prevent the kind of movement shown in the photo. But there was Robert Chen, apparently alert and reaching toward Sarah's camera, captured in a digital image that should have shown him lying flat and motionless. I called Sarah immediately, asking her to describe the transport in detail. She insisted that everything had been normal, no movement in the transport bay, no unusual sounds, no indication that anything had shifted or changed during the drive. When she'd opened the bay at Riverside Funeral Home, Mr. Chen was properly positioned exactly as he'd been loaded at the hospital. Mr. DeMarco, I don't understand these photos, Sarah told me. What you're showing me doesn't match what I saw when I was actually there. It's like the camera is capturing something different from what's really happening. That's when I stopped looking at the transport photos. Every morning, I still download the images from the previous night's runs, and I still file them in our record system. The drivers continue following the documentation protocol, taking before and after photos of every transport. The folders accumulate in our filing system, properly labeled and organized according to standard administrative procedures. But I haven't opened any of those image files in 6 weeks. I transfer them from the tablets to our storage system without viewing them, maintaining our documentation requirements while protecting myself from seeing whatever those photos continue to capture. Sometimes, when I'm filing the unopened folders, I wonder what the images show now. Whether the deceased are still changing positions between the before and after shots, whether they're still reaching toward the cameras, whether they're trying to communicate something that I'm no longer willing to see. The drivers haven't asked about the photos recently. They take the required images and submit them as requested, but they don't mention the content anymore, and I don't ask. We all understand that some parts of this job are better left unexamined, that some documentation serves its purpose without being closely reviewed. I still file those folders every morning, adding them to a collection that grows larger each week. Hundreds of unopened image files, each containing before and after photos of our transports, waiting in digital storage for someone brave enough to discover what the camera sees that our eyes cannot. I watched myself die on Route 8, and no one ever asked why I was 3 hours late. My name is Grace Holloway, and I drive transport for Memorial Services, covering the rural routes that connect small-town funeral homes with regional cemeteries and crematoriums. I've been doing this work for 9 years, ever since I moved to the area from Chicago, looking for a quieter life and steadier employment. The rural routes suit my temperament: long stretches of empty highway, peaceful countryside, and the solitude that comes with driving through farmland and forest where cell phone coverage is spotty and traffic is minimal. Most of my transports follow predictable patterns. Pickup at small funeral homes that serve farming communities, delivery to Pine Hills Cemetery or Riverside Crematorium, occasionally a transfer to the county medical examiner when circumstances require additional investigation. The drives are lengthy but not complicated, 60 to 90 minutes each way, traveling highways that cut through agricultural areas where the landscape changes with the seasons but the roads remain constant. I know every mile of Route 8, the main highway that connects the western communities in my territory. It's a well-maintained 2-lane road that follows the valley between rolling hills, crossing occasional bridges over streams and passing through woodlands that provide shade during summer months. During my 9 years driving that route, I've encountered the usual minor problems: flat tires, engine trouble, weather delays, but nothing that couldn't be resolved with a phone call to dispatch and some patience while help arrived. Last Tuesday afternoon, I was transporting Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez from Millbrook Funeral Home to Pine Hills Cemetery for a late afternoon burial service. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez was 81 years old, had lived her entire life in the same small farming community, and was being laid to rest beside her husband, who had died 3 years earlier. Routine arrangements, proper documentation, everything coordinated with the cemetery staff to ensure arrival by 4 o'clock for the family gathering. The drive to Pine Hills Cemetery normally takes 57 minutes from Millbrook, following Route 8 north through the valley, then turning east on Cemetery Road for the final 3 miles. I had made the trip dozens of times and knew the timing: precisely departure by 3 o'clock to allow for traffic or minor delays, arrival with 15 minutes to spare for any last-minute coordination with the burial crew. I left Millbrook at 2:55 with Mrs. Vasquez properly secured in the transport bay, her funeral arrangements confirmed, and clear weather for the drive. Route 8 was empty except for occasional farm vehicles and the usual light traffic you'd expect on a Tuesday afternoon in rural country. I maintained steady speed and stayed on schedule, anticipating an on-time arrival that would give the family a few extra minutes to gather before the burial service. 38 minutes into the drive, just past the bridge that crosses Mill Creek, my van's engine began making irregular sounds. Not the dramatic failure of a major breakdown, but the subtle irregularities that suggest developing problem: slight hesitation during acceleration, occasional rough idling at stops, the kind of mechanical issues that experienced drivers recognize as warning signs of more serious trouble ahead. I pulled over at a scenic overlook about 2 miles past the creek bridge, a small paved area beside the highway where travelers sometimes stop to enjoy the view of the valley. The overlook was empty except for my van, surrounded by the quiet rural landscape that stretched for miles in all directions. No houses visible, no other traffic, just the peaceful isolation that characterizes that stretch of Route 8. I called dispatch to report the mechanical problem and request roadside assistance. The call went straight to voicemail. Cell coverage in that area has always been unreliable, and emergency services sometimes take longer to respond to rural locations. I left a detailed message explaining my location and the nature of the problem, then settled in to wait for help while monitoring the burial service schedule. While waiting, I performed basic troubleshooting, checking fluid levels, looking for obvious signs of mechanical failure, trying to identify the source of the engine irregularities. Everything appeared normal under the hood, and the van started without difficulty when I tested it, but the rough idling persisted. Not safe to continue driving, especially with precious cargo, but not an emergency that required immediate evacuation. 20 minutes after I'd called for assistance, I saw another funeral van approaching from the south, traveling in the same direction I'd been heading. As it got closer, I realized it was identical to my own vehicle, same make, same model, same memorial services markings, even the same license plate number. I assumed it was one of our other drivers, perhaps coming to assist or to take over the transport if my mechanical problems couldn't be resolved quickly. The duplicate van pulled over behind mine in the scenic overlook, parking in almost the exact position where my van would have been if I'd backed up 20 feet. The engine shut off, and I could see the driver's door opening, though the afternoon sunlight made it difficult to identify which of my colleagues had come to help. The driver who stepped out of the duplicate van looked exactly like me. Same height, same build, same memorial services uniform, same dark hair pulled back in the same practical style I wear during work hours. She moved with my mannerisms, carried herself with my posture, and walked toward the rear of her van with the same purposeful stride I use when handling transport duties. I stood beside my own van, watching my double open the back doors of her vehicle and begin unloading a gurney. But what she was unloading wasn't Mrs. Vasquez or any other transport I recognized. The body on the gurney was wearing my clothes, had my face, and appeared to be my own corpse, being prepared for transport to some unknown destination. The other Grace, the one who looked exactly like me, handled the body with professional care, adjusting the position on the gurney, checking the securing straps, and preparing for what appeared to be a routine delivery. She showed no awareness of my presence in the overlook, no acknowledgement that the real Grace Holloway was standing 30 feet away, watching her load my apparent remains into a transport van identical to the one I'd been driving. As she wheeled the gurney toward the rear of her van, I could see the face of the body more clearly. It was unmistakably my own face, not similar, not resembling, but exactly my features, my expression, my physical appearance down to details that only I would recognize. The body was dressed in the same memorial services uniform I was wearing, positioned in the same manner we use for all our transports. The other Grace loaded the gurney into her van, secured it according to standard protocol, and closed the rear doors. She walked around to the driver's side, paused briefly to look in my direction without any sign of recognition, then got in and started the engine. The duplicate van pulled out of the scenic overlook and continued north on Route 8, heading in the direction of Pine Hill Cemetery or beyond. I watched it disappear around the curve past the next hill, leaving me alone with my broken-down van and Mrs. Vasquez still secured in my transport bay. 5 minutes later, my van's engine started normally and ran smoothly without any of the irregularities that had forced me to pull over. I drove the remaining distance to Pine Hill Cemetery without further mechanical problems, arriving at 6:47 p.m., nearly 3 hours after my scheduled delivery time. The cemetery staff helped me unload Mrs. Vasquez and proceed with the burial service as if nothing unusual had occurred. The family had been waiting, but they accepted my apology for the delay without asking for detailed explanations. The burial proceeded normally, and I completed all required paperwork without mentioning the mechanical breakdown or the encounter with my double. When I returned to the depot that evening, dispatch had no record of receiving my voicemail requesting roadside assistance. No one asked about the 3-hour delay, no one mentioned mechanical problems, and no one seemed concerned that I'd been unreachable for most of the afternoon. I filed a routine maintenance request for engine evaluation, but the mechanics found no problems with the van during their inspection the following day. All systems tested normal, and they couldn't identify any mechanical issues that would explain the breakdown I'd experienced. I still drive Route 8 several times each week, passing that scenic overlook where I watched myself being loaded into a duplicate transport van, Sometimes I wonder if the Grace, who continued driving that day, was the real one, and if the person who returned to work was somehow the replacement. Whether I completed Mrs. Vasquez's transport or if another version of me handled that delivery while I remained broken down beside the highway. But I've learned not to ask questions about delays that no one remembers, and I don't report breakdowns that leave no mechanical evidence. Some routes have destinations that aren't marked on any schedule, and some arrivals happen whether the original driver makes it to the end of the journey or not.